I'm Amanda, and this is Not Your Granny's Quilt Show. Hello, hello. Welcome to today's episode. Today we have Audrey of Gibson Threads. She's here today to share about her quilting calculator that she programmed and wrote up herself because she is a really cool software developer, and she shows how to use it. So um she does a pretty good job of explaining everything and voicing what she's doing and talking through what she's doing. I just think it's so cool to be able to see it, and she shares her screen in this episode so that you're able to see what she's done or what she's doing with the quilt calculator. So if you can jump on YouTube and watch this one, it's totally worth it to take the time to do that. Um, anyway, she developed this quilt calculator with quilters in mind of wanting to figure out how to get the right amount of fabrics for different quilt blocks. So if it's a more traditional block, you can plug in the different pieces and parts. Like a sawtooth star, for example, is made up of squares and flying geese. You can plug those components in, and the calculator will tell you how much of each fabric to buy for each piece that you put in. So it's super, super cool, super thoughtful. This is a hobby for her, so she's fixing bugs and adding features as she has time and availability to do so, but you're going to just get so much benefit out of that. So put your learning caps on, be ready to get your minds blown by this, and let's get into it with Audrey. Hi, Audrey. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm so good. I'm so glad that you're on the show because I you gave a talk on the Quarter Inch Collective when we do our bi-monthly uh what are they? Not professional, like industry professional calls and stuff. So you were on talking about your quilt calculator, which we'll get to because we're going to talk about it. Um, and again, to reiterate, like if you're listening, you're going to want to go to YouTube to watch because Audrey's going to demonstrate it for us and we're going to talk through it as best as possible, but you will you're going to show it so that people can actually see how it functions, which is great. So anyway, all that disclaimer to get to, I just want to know how you got into quilting in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an adorable story. My grandmother was a longtime quilter, long before I was even born. And I learned to quilt with her, I think at about 9. I remember, elementary school age, and really loving like the act of sewing. But you're a kid and then you're a teenager and then you're kind of not as interested in sewing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until the pandemic where I realized that I had her sewing machine, which I was using to like mend clothes and the like. And
Hmm.
I had her unfinished project. She passed in that time period.
Mm.
And I really just wanted to finish a couple of her unfinished projects. And I
Hmm.
remembered enough about how to sew where that was not an unreasonable task. I had blocks and I just wanted to put them together.
Hmm.
And just the act of finishing a couple of quilts was immediately addicting, as I'm sure we're all really familiar with. And
Yeah.
so I would argue that I'm a pandemic starter, but I am somewhere in between like traditionally taught and self-taught because there was a lot
Okay.
of traditional teachings, but then I heavily relied on like YouTube and the like. Shout out to Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I would not be here without her. And so that's how I started, and I've really enjoyed it since. I am still using some of her scraps and pulling them together because quilters will always have remaining scraps long after
Yeah.
they've passed,
Yeah.
which I say with love to anyone worried about that.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's how I got started.
Wow, that's so cool and so fun. Like, I think there are so many self-taught sewists and quilters now that it's like it's fun to hear that, you know, from people that it got passed down from a family member because I think it's like, well, nobody sewed in my household. I just found that and I love it so much. And so, almost people like millennial generation and younger are kind of picking it up as like I'm going to start this for my family now. Like I'm going to pass this hobby to whoever will listen. So that's so fun. And My grandma sewed a lot too. My mom has sewn, so, like, I come from that kinda same background of, like, it's just always been around, but that's so cool and so sweet that you were able to finish some of her unfinished business. Because I think that that's such a bummer when you kinda see that stuff at, like, thrift stores or estate sales or stuff. It's like, it's such a bummer because 'cause you're like, "What?
Yeah, yeah, and she had
Nobody
great
wanted to pick
style
this up?"
too. Like,
Yeah.
a lot of her stuff, I'd even argue, leans pretty modern.
Mm.
She uses some solids in a couple of her quilts, which is kind of unheard of prior to 2010, I'd say.
Yeah.
And so it's fun to go back and, like, look at her finished work, but also her unfinished work and be like, she kinda had an eye for what was coming. I could tell kind of thing.
Yeah. That's awesome. So when in all that did you decide to start, you know, sharing your stuff online and Instagram and stuff?
Yeah, I was living in Seattle and the quilt guild that was meeting was kind of in a location that was hard for me to get to. So I was
Mhm.
craving like an element of community, but the quilt guild at the time where I was living and just coming out of the pandemic wasn't super accessible to me at that time. And so
Mhm.
I was largely on Reddit sharing, photos and the like, but Reddit is structured in a way where you don't necessarily remember users, posts just kind of come and flow and
Yeah.
totally respect that. Still post to Reddit myself, but I was craving more of like I remember this person and their past projects and what they're doing in the future. Or I like this designer a lot. I want to keep up to date with their designs. And
Yeah.
so I joined Instagram kind of with that mindset of like, I want to keep up to date and I want to have a better connection of like that person and their produced quilts. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so cool, and, like, it is such a huge community of people. I think that's I mean, I didn't know that, like, the quilty Instagram world really even existed prior to getting into quilting in 2017, which was, like, seems like forever ago now, but it was, like, a whole new world even though I'd been around sewing and stuff my whole life, like, just finding that element of Instagram versus just, like, finding people's pictures of food at restaurants, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's yeah, that's so cool. And um, so as far as, like, Gibson Threads goes, like, was that initially how you showed up online, or was that something that, like, came about after?
More or less, I wanted at first to kind of anonymize, so not have my name, Audrey, on the page.
Mhm,
And so I was really more thinking of like words in relation to quilting that I liked, and then like a word to identify. I think a lot of folks do this. Alderwood Studio is one of my favorites. I'm sure Alderwood is just in reference to the tree, because I know she's in the Pacific Northwest, but it's recognizable enough where you don't need to necessarily remember a specific name. You can remember their kind of broader brand.
mhm.
Um, but then when I started to build the quilting calculator, I actually was really appreciative that I had the brand itself so that I could instead reference the website to that instead of saying, Audrey's fun little quilt calculator.com.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, kinda gives you, like, a I think for some people, they want it to feel more official for them to take it seriously, and so I can understand that kind of perspective of, like, wanting to distance your personal self from it and make it more branded as far as, like, yeah, not having it's like, "Oh, this is just my pet project." It's like, "No, I'm a serious quilter, and I want you to understand that this is meaningful to me." Like, I don't know,
Yeah.
like, put a little serious spin on it, but still show that you love it so much, and that's cool.
Yeah.
And so where did the name Gibson come from?
I feel bad for saying this publicly because
Oh.
it's my favorite security question, so I need to go back and change it. But
Oh.
Gibson is just the name of the road that I grew up on.
Oh, okay.
So if anyone wants to hack any of my systems, that's probably the security question. But it's more so just a nice starting place in my mind was the name Gibson. And then
Sure.
threads is a funny reference to computer science where machines run in threads. And so if you want something to run more quickly, you have more threads dedicated to that task. And so
Mhm.
I liked the overlap of sewing having threads and computer science having threads. So
Mhm.
it's more of a nerdy reference than it needs to be, but it's a generic enough name that it can, blend in.
Yeah. And I love that though, because it's a nod to the things that you're passionate about and that you are finding ways to blend your love of sewing and quilting and your love of, computer science and techie stuff together. So that's really cool. And so were you like struggling to math out quilts that you wanted to make and so you decided to write the quilt calculator or
Honestly, the opposite. I
okay.
enjoyed doing it so much of identifying, the components that build a quilt block, and then basically reverse engineering quilts on a regular basis. But I was doing it with, back of the napkin kind of math. And so I wanted to create just a calculator to quickly reference.
Mhm.
I would often see a more traditional design and not sure how to put it together. I would just break it into its little pieces and then I could, based on the size that I desired, just reverse engineer it pretty quickly.
Mhm.
And so it's more so that I enjoyed the math aspect so much that I just wanted it to be easily accessible and easily referenceable to myself, but also to others. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so cool. And I like it is tricky to look at something and like not necessarily be able to find a pattern for it. Then there's so many times where I've seen quilts and I'm like, oh, I'll just like take a screenshot and Google Lens it and see if I can find a pattern or whatever. And it's like, I can't find it.
Yes.
And is cool and as in depth as the internet can be, it's like, unless you have lots of time dedicated or that you can dedicate to like scouring the bowels of the internet, like sometimes those things are just hard. So being able to like, yeah, reverse engineer it is a nice idea for some people, but I think it is daunting and overwhelming. And like, unless you know the basic structure of like the blocks that make up that quilt or can kind of figure that out, like it's hard. It's a tricky piece. And so I love that you were willing to like make that a thing because I think people want to make more quilts and maybe don't really have access to maybe even purchase patterns or they just have an idea in their head and they want to suss it out and see if it'll work. Like other quilt calculators I've seen are just like it just helps you like, oh, I need to cut 25 squares or 25, rectangles and it'll tell you how much yardage to buy or I need to buy this much backing and batting or whatever, but it's not as detailed as I think as what you've created. So, um, I guess we can like jump into that if you want to start showing it and I can make sure you can share your screen really quick.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I'm excited. I definitely I see a lot of ideas out there and I'm like, oh, I would scale this slightly differently or the like. And so this is really meant to be like a playful tool.
Yeah.
Let me share this application screen. Can you see the quilting calculator?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through. I'm referring to it here as the piecing yardage calculator. This is more meant for like search optimization that I have so many words conglomerated right here.
Okay.
It's more just this is the calculator for your fabric yardage of a quilt top. And then I have other basic calculators like a backing and binding calculator
Okay.
which I'll show in more detail because I have new features for those coming out sometime this calendar year, so sometime before 2025.
Okay.
Yeah, so the quilt fabric calculator really operates in a very simple, we imagine that you have a quilt top with repeated blocks on the quilt top. So I'll pull up the example quilt here, and this is just really a very simple sawtooth star kind of imagined piece. It's not technically a sawtooth star because it has half square triangles off to the corner.
Hmm.
And this link is on my website as well. So for
Okay.
those that aren't seeing this, you can always go back and you'll see the advanced example. But
Okay.
this quilt block here is just broken down into a couple of quilt block components, and that's what I call them. So
Mhm.
for those listening in, that the quilt block components here are HSTs in the corners, a
Mhm.
rectangle in the center, and then flying geese between those cornerstones. And so it just comes down to breaking the quilt block into those couple of components, identifying the size that you may be interested in, and then adding the fabric and hitting submit more or less. So for example, I call out that this is a 18-inch square. So the corners themselves, I'd like them to be about 4.5-inch square unfinished. So before they're added to the rest of the quilt block.
Mhm.
Flying geese between them, 4.5 inches high by 8.5 inches wide, and that will
Mhm.
make up the quilt length, or excuse me, the width.
Mhm.
And then the inside is just one simple square, an 8.5-inch square.
Yeah. And for people who don't know, because I taught third grade and we talked a lot about quadrilaterals or four-sided polygons or shapes, a rectangle is a square. Or no, a rectangle can be a square and a square is a rectangle. So, um, if it's called a rectangle, it can still be a square. So don't get confused if you see rectangle, you're like, but that's a square. It's because they can be the same thing essentially in certain parameters. So
That's a great call out. I always add things. Yes, I was like, oh, I'll add rectangle. It's clearly a square in this diagram here, but I'm more so when we get to it referencing what you'll plug in the calculator. So that's a
yeah.
good call out because yes, squares are rectangles, and rectangle is an overarching term that includes squares. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
so effectively just filling in these couple of blocks. So going back to my quilt calculator, I can show you. So if you imagine the quilt top as a whole, you're going to want a repeat of these blocks. I'm going to recommend, say, 12. I know 12 or 9 is like a common display of the quilt top block repeat.
mhm.
And then you can click to add your fabric types.
Okay.
In this example that we're showing here, it's very simple. There's just 2 fabric types. But this is very friendly to if you have really complicated blocks with a lot of different fabrics in them. As we are recording this, the solstice sampler is going on. And
Mhm.
what I love about the solstice sampler is it's a lot of different fabrics in those quilt tops. And so you can still build out and imagine more usage of those quilt fabrics in there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to quickly change this to a green for the what is referred to as the A fabric,
Okay.
and then a white for the B fabric. One thing to call out here is that this is assuming imperial units. So for those on the metric system, this is not yet built for you. I apologize. Um, I do hope that you can Google, yards to meters,
Yeah.
but the binding and backing calculators do have a metric usage. So it's just this one that doesn't quite have it. It's a little complicated to implement. Um,
Yeah.
but for those that are watching, you'll notice that you can also set your width of fabric here. Most quilting fabrics, as we know, are anywhere between 40 and 44 inches wide.
Mhm.
So I've just set them to 42 as kind of a common average.
Yeah, it's generally safe. And yeah, it's like one measurement system at a time. You got to work out the bugs with this one first and then maybe
Yes.
eventually add metric.
And that's actually a good time to call out, like, this is a hobby here. This probably has bugs. In fact, I know of a couple of bugs. I'm not going to call them out in this call, but I really want to be available to anyone that uses this, especially on a regular basis. So
Yeah.
feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. I also have a contact page on the website itself,
Okay.
but that's a good call out as we see bugs. Like, I want to be available to you. I may not be able to fix it immediately because this is a hobby, but
Right.
this this is ever growing, this is evolving, this is meant to be as useful as possible. So if you see something wrong, do feel free to call it out.
Great. That's awesome.
The
Okay, sorry,
next
back to the
portion,
building.
yeah, back to the building of the quilt. The next portion is, I think, where people often get a little confused, and that
Yeah.
is to add quilt block components. So going back to our example block here, we have quilt block components that break and that make up the quilt block, and those
Mhm.
quilt blocks make up the quilt top.
Right.
I feel a little Dr. Seussy with these rhyming, but ultimately, quilt block components are just small pieces to make up your quilt blocks, which repeat on your quilt top.
Yes.
So here we know that we have in the corners, we have half square triangles. And as I called out at the very beginning, I want those unfinished sizes to be 4.5 inches.
Mhm.
That's height and width because half square triangles are squares. And I want 4 of them total. So setting the repeat of that quilt component to 4. And then I'm going to quickly set the fabric types just with the 2 fabric types that I created up at the top.
Okay.
These quilt block components are meant to be really simple. I don't have all components possible. For example, the hourglass quarter, quarter square triangle, I think is also
Mhm.
it's called. I don't have that one, and I'm missing others. And I would love to be able to add like common pieces, for example, like log cabins and the like.
Mhm.
But this right now, the quilt block component options come down to flying geese, a rectangle slash a square, because those
Mhm.
are the same thing in this calculator's perspective,
Yeah.
a half square triangle, and a snowball. But there are other suggestions. I would love to be able to add them, so do feel free to reach out if you have other ideas, because I can only improve, basically.
Yeah. Sure.
The next quilt block component that we'll add, going back to our example, is the flying geese here.
Mhm.
And that, again, we want a height of 4.5, we want a width of 8.5, and we want to repeat because it's along each edge of your quilt block of 4.
Okay.
I'm setting the left color to A, the middle color to B, and the right color to A. For those that are just listening, that just puts the darker color to the corners, and a new color in the center of that flying geese.
Okay.
And then we're almost done. We just add the square for the center, which we determined to be a height of 8.5 and a width of 8.5. And we just need one of those for each quilt block. And
Right.
we're going to set the fill color in this case to B, so the lighter of the 2 colors.
Okay. And so this is just one quilt block. You're breaking down all the components. So you're saying for one block, I need this many corners, and which you're making half square triangles instead of a solid corner or a solid square. And then the 4 flying geese, because that's on each side of the center square, and then 1 center square. So that's just one block. But at the top, you set how many of those you're going to want. So you're saying, I want this many quilt blocks. Here's the fabrics I want. And now you're telling it what that, what to make of, like, I want 12 of this. Like, if that
Yes.
makes any sense. I'm just trying to clarify for like, if I'm like trying to think through this and go in and use it, I'm like, okay, I need to make sure I understand like what I'm telling it to do. So I'm telling it I need this many blocks, I'm using this many fabrics, and then this is how I'm building this block. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And I'll add for anyone that is watching, I have additional details with definitions, and I even have a reference page of like kind of an encyclopedia, more or less, of this calculator. And
Okay.
that's under an additional link, additional details link on this quilting calculator. For those that already feel lost, if you happen to feel lost, that exists, and feel free to explore there. And again, feel free to reach out to me. I really want to be as helpful as possible.
Yeah. And this is helping just seeing it happen. Like, yeah, again, I'm strongly urging people to go to the YouTube if you can, because seeing it is 1,000 times gonna be make 1,000 times more sense than just listening. But for if you can just listen and understand it, more power to you. So, okay,
Yeah,
keep going.
I like to imagine someone's in like traffic right now on their way
Taking
to work,
notes.
and they're like, okay, an HST 4 times, sure.
Yeah.
Um, This is the drum roll part. So now we can calculate our fabric need based
Okay.
on what we plugged in. So for the A fabric, and it'll highlight the width of fabric that you plugged in, we have an estimated fabric need of 1 3/4 yard. And for the B fabric, we have an estimated need of 2 1/4 yard. And that it rounds up in a lot of areas. So
Okay.
you'll be like, okay, but there's probably, and it's more so because I know there are people, for example, that wash their fabric, and so there's shrinkage. And I know
Mm,
people they may make a mistake or they're anxious that they'll make a mistake. So this, if you're close to 1/3 yard, it bumps up to 1/2 yard,
okay.
and on and on. So it's meant to be kind of safekeeping.
Okay. So a little conservative as far as like you're gonna have extra just in case, and it's not gonna underestimate, it'll overestimate for safety.
Yeah, yeah, it
Okay.
errs on the side of overestimating. That's a good way to put it.
Okay. That's great.
I will say that a feature that I'd love to build is kind of a reverse way of thinking, and that is I have 1/8 of a yard and I want to be able to use this fabric for this, set of components. Is
Yeah.
that possible? I don't currently have that set up where, because I'm going the more conservative route of like this will fit positively.
Uh-huh.
You're probably going to get a round up that isn't matching what your scrap is. Uh,
Right.
but stay tuned because I know that's a broad interest, and that is obviously helpful for anyone using, for example, like thrifted fabrics where you only have what you have. You can't go to the quilt store and get more.
Right. Right. Yeah. That'll
And
be
then
an
the feature that honestly took me the longest out of all of this and is still, I'm saying that it's still in beta because by that I mean it's still not completely finished because there's a lot of room for improvement here. And that
uh-huh.
is displaying the cut map, more or
Oh.
less, so
Mhm.
that you know how to cut out your fabrics with the like optimum view.
Yeah.
This makes a lot of assumptions, this cut map here.
Mhm.
One thing it makes is it assumes that you want to make your HSTs and flying geese in the Magic 8 or Magic 4 or Magic 2 ways. Not everyone likes to make their HSTs with, for example, the Magic 8 method.
Mhm.
And for those that don't know, the Magic 8 method is effectively you sew a larger block, a larger piece of fabric in an odd diagonal crisscrossy way, and then cut it up in an odd diagonal crisscrossy way. But
Mhm.
you make 8 HSTs at once instead of having to make a whole bunch of smaller ones and cut a whole bunch of triangles together to make a whole bunch of HSTs.
Yeah.
I made this assumption because that's how I like to operate. So this is really built with my bias in mind.
Sure.
And my cut map highlights that. So it'll call out areas where you're going to need to make and cut out a larger block in order to make those HSTs. It
Okay.
does not, unfortunately, at this point, say that that's what it's doing. So there are
Okay.
improvements that I'd like to make to this cut map to make it more clear that that's why it's structured in this way. But it does show the various block components, and how best to cut it out so that you're saving your fabric and your time, basically.
Yeah. Optimizing, yeah, the cuts of the fabric so that you're not like wasting a bunch of extra or like you're getting the least amount of waste possible.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, it's interesting to see different patterns too, like how they come up because like sometimes there are a lot of HSTs and it's like you could essentially do an 8 at a time or like a 4 at a time method, but a lot of times it's just like the 2 at a time method, which is, pretty, I think, standard more than like cutting the triangles separately and then building it. Like, but I've always enjoyed when there are when the 8 at a time method is written into a pattern because, yeah, it's optimizing. Like, you're still sewing seams and you're still, pairing fabrics. But I think when you can take the same larger piece of, or pair of fabrics, sew, the diagonals and then cut that apart, it's like, okay, now I've got 8 and I sewed 4 seams, whereas you would have had to sew, so many other seams and like I don't know. It just feels more effective. So I like that that's kind of where your head's at because it is more optimal and I think it saves more fabric in the long run. But
I do imagine too, it's probably a more modern way of doing it.
Hmm.
In my latest project, I deep dived into a lot of traditional quilt blocks, and what I realized in reading a lot of the instructions of it is something that we all know is to be true, which is rotary cutters didn't exist in quilting until fairly recently, like
Right.
2 or 3 decades ago. And so cutting pieces out with scissors was the go-to method, especially, with scrap fabric. And so the idea of cutting, very straight grain pieces is relatively
Hmm.
modern. And then in this case, cutting larger pieces to cut up into smaller pieces because of the ease of rotary cutter, trimming,
Yeah.
is probably pretty modern too. That's an assumption. Please fact check that.
Yeah.
But yeah, to lean into the not your granny's quilt show, like the idea of 8 at a time, and obviously the idea of a website giving you recommended fabric cuts, not your
Yeah.
granny's way of quilting for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's great. Like, we have tools and we have methods to make it easier on us so that we're not, it is more accessible to people time-wise because you're not having to spend months and months to put a quilt together because of the tools we have. And I think it doesn't demean or like take away from the process of where it came from. And I think that's ultimately, I think sometimes people's gripe about maybe like upgrades or technology or including, different tools and stuff into quilting is like, oh, it's not as traditional. It's like, that's okay. Like, I mean, you can do it however you want, but I think for a lot of like newer and younger quilters, like having the ability to like do things more quickly is better because we're still working and we're busy and we have, other things going on in our lives that's like this is our hobby, but we also need to optimize our time to be doing it. So when there's things like tools that can help us get it done faster, not necessarily like cut corners and the quality's not diminished. It's just like where can we find time savers to help us accomplish what we want to accomplish with our hobbies and our goals. So I love
Yeah.
that.
And
It's
I
so
think
cool.
always something to highlight in quilting is quilting's kind of a hobby of six other hobbies.
Hmm.
The process of designing a quilt is your own thing. The process of picking out the fabrics for the quilt design, that's its own thing. And then
Yeah.
cutting up fabric is a set of skills that is unique to the rest of the quilting process. And then piecing, especially chain piecing or however you like to go about it, keeping those lines straight and making sure you're using the right thread and the right foot. And then the process of putting together a quilt top, ironing is like
Yeah.
a set of 5 or 6 skills together.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I've learned. And then obviously the act of quilting. Many people, send off to long armors as a way to save themselves time and
Yeah.
effort. Perfectly respectable, because it's its own skill, especially on
Yeah.
a small throat domestic machine.
Hmm.
And then binding. A lot of people hate binding. I love binding for some reason. Um,
Yeah.
and uh, and so quilting in itself is like several different hobbies in a way
Hmm.
because there are pieces that don't really give credence to other aspects of the quilt process.
Yeah, for sure. I love it. Well, I hope people check out your quilt calculator because that's so handy. And like, I literally have a job coming up for a client, and I'm like, well, I'm going to use this because this will help me make the size of, I'm making sawtooth stars and um, putting Erin Nicole's silly goose block in the center of the sawtooth stars. So that should be really
Perfect.
fun. But anyway, yeah, that'll be great. Perfect for me to figure out how much I need.
I would love to also show or describe the upcoming feature with the binding and backing calculator if you're
Yeah. Yeah,
interested.
let's show that because I think too that's another hard part. And as like I'm a long armor, so obviously it's near and dear to my heart for people to know this. But I think a lot of times in patterns too, the backing and the well, backing specifically because binding is just binding, right? It's the perimeter of the quilt. But the backing um needs like if you're going to quilt on your domestic machine, you don't need the same overage as a long arm quilter does because we have we have to have the extra width and length for attaching that backing to our machines. And if it's not big enough, like the machine, the stitch plate like runs into our pins or like our red snappers or whatever you're using for connecting the quilt pieces to the frame, like we have to have that extra. So the assumption in some quilt patterns is like it's not enough backing. And so being able to calculate correctly how much you need is like actually really important if you're going to be sending your quilts out, or even if you're long arming for yourself. Like if you don't have enough backing, you don't have enough backing, and it's a
Yeah.
really big shame.
Yeah, and if you have a grain preference, for example, you're using a print on the back, that's
Hmm.
pretty tricky to calculate the backing need if you want the grain in a certain orientation, or you want to make sure that it aligns well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like I have made many a backing wrong, and that is solely because I do it in convoluted ways and I follow the after quilt method. Again, shout out to Karen Brown of
Mm,
Just Get It Done Quilts, because I often have leftover fabric. And I don't necessarily have a lot of use for, say, a hot pink that I used in this quilt. And
yeah.
so I'll put those scraps together in a column and extend my backing fabric so that I make sure to use up those little pieces that would kind of easily go overlooked.
Yeah.
This backing calculator doesn't fully show that in a way, but I'll explain a little bit why it could be helpful, especially if you're an after quilt maker like I am.
Okay.
But starting off with the binding calculator, and again, for those that are listening, this isn't currently live on my website, but by the time this podcast goes up, I'm hoping that this will be available to you. Again,
Okay.
this should be done by the end of 2024. So if you don't
Okay.
see it on the website, do feel free to complain to me because that's entirely my fault.
It'll just encourage you to get it out there.
Exactly, exactly. So yeah, this binding calculator, and in a lot of ways, binding again is pretty simple. It's the perimeter of the quilt. But
Mhm.
if you have a preference on the grain direction, I recently started to cut out my bindings on the straight grain so they don't stretch as much. And
Yeah.
wow, it's actually a noticeable difference in the quality of that binding.
Yeah.
And so this calculator now gives credence to the orientation preference that you may or may not have.
Okay.
So just to put in an example, let's make a fairly small quilt, a 50 by 50 quilt. This is like smaller than your throw quilt.
Mhm.
Um, and a binding width of 2.5 inches. That's pretty common.
Mhm.
Again, here you can set your width of fabric. I've set it as a default of 42 inches. That's just common. You may have, a 108 or whatever.
Mhm.
And then the grain preference, we'll start out with cross grain and then I'll show you the straight grain example as well.
Okay. And the cross grain is like that's on the bias,
Oh,
right?
sorry, that's actually a great thing to call out. Cross grain is perpendicular to your selvage versus
Oh,
straight
okay.
grain is parallel to your
Parallel.
selvage.
Okay. Right, right, right. I was like, wait, what? Okay, got it.
That's a great call out. A lot of I only recently started to really care about this when someone
Yeah.
had given me the tip of cutting the binding on the straight grain. And it's not worth your time if you don't have the time for it, I will say. Like
Yeah.
it's totally acceptable to choose the straight and the cross grain, which is easier to cut out in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
But if you have the time and the interest, I recommend trying out the straight grain.
Yeah. And if you're using a print, sometimes you have to do cross grain to get like stripes sometimes
Yes.
are running the wrong way if you want it for bindings, because if you cut it straight grain, it's going to just be long straight lines. Whereas if you want the like stripy effect to, run perpendicular to the edges of the quilt, like then you have to cut it cross grain. So
Yes, yes. And I
yeah.
will also note that I think Art Gallery Fabrics is now doing like specialized binding. I haven't
Mm,
tried it out myself,
I
but I
have it and
believe
it's
this
lovely.
is it good.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
I believe you cut that out on the cross grain as well. So there's a
Yeah.
preference there. But if you had a straight grain preference for whatever reason, the stability or the pattern, you
Yeah.
could choose that. This then shows you the quilt perimeter, which is something easily calculatable, but it
Mhm.
adds a rough estimate for how much seam allowance you need and leaving in room for your mitered corners, which takes up a little bit extra.
Yeah.
So the quilt perimeter here with our 50 by 50 quilt is just 200, and
Mhm.
it gives you an estimate of 202 for the binding. and then an estimated need of half yard. And then it gives you a cut recommendation, which is cutting 5 strips along your cross grain. So
Hmm.
again, perpendicular to your selvage, and it shows you cutting five columns.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's
In this
awesome.
way, you could quickly switch to straight grain of like, okay, now that I know what the cross grain estimate is, how much more fabric or what's the different with my straight grain. So
Yeah.
here I changed it to straight grain. It recommends 208 inches for the binding.
Okay.
And again, that's just because you have more to connect with you have more pieces to connect together, so you have more seam allowance to account for.
Hmm.
But it's still an estimated need of a half yard, and you're going to cut 12 strips from that straight grain.
Okay. Okay. That's so cool.
So
I
pretty
love that.
simple. The reason it's not currently up on my website yet is just simply I need to test it more. I don't want to release something that's massively wrong, as I've done in the past for anyone that went to the Quarter Inch Collective meeting. There was a bug, but ultimately I want to make sure that I give you guys high quality tools before releasing them into the wild.
Yeah, for sure. It's just cool to see that it's like out there and it's going to be available and that somebody's putting in the effort to make this available to other quilters to like help simplify because I think, we all have something to offer and this is what you are passionate about offering and like you said it's your hobby so it's not like you're not going to put like a day job's worth of work into it all the time, but just the fact that you're willing to do it on your free time as a hobby is just so incredible and so generous. So this is awesome.
I will admit it's not fully altruistic. There's definitely a benefit to my career by me keeping up my programming capabilities.
Sure.
So thank you for calling it generous in that I'm sharing it, but
Yeah.
it's beneficial for me too, I promise. And obviously as a quilter, I do use these tools, so it's nice to just practice in a different form related to quilting.
Yeah.
So here is the backing calculator, and this one, the display is a little bit more funky, but similarly, I'm just going to plug in a width of fabric of 42 inches, a height and width of 50 inches, and a backing margin. I know long armors generally prefer 8 to 10 inches total, so that'd be 4 inches on each side. So I'm
Hmm.
putting in a backing margin of about 8 inches.
Okay.
Here you can set your grain direction preference. It defaults to the grain going widthwise, so follow in the grain going with the width of your quilt.
Hmm.
Um, you can also set the grain to go with the length of your quilt. I played around with referencing straight grain versus cross grain here, but ultimately it's kind of hard to describe. Your width that you set in needs to go along something. Do you
Yeah.
want the straight grain or the straight grain to go with your width of your quilt
Right.
or to go with the length of your quilt? And that's what it's calling out here.
Yeah.
I do have like details of what that means in a link on this for anyone interested.
Right.
So that kind of describes the thinking behind why you may have a preference on grain direction. For
Yeah.
example, if the pattern on the backing matters a lot to you. Um,
Hmm.
but I'm going to set it as no preference just for this example. And this gives you a very quick reference of a recommended 3¼ yards, and it shows you why. And that
Hmm.
is because your quilt, the 50 by 50 inch quilt, goes slightly over your width of fabric, which is 42 inches. And so you
Hmm.
have an overhang that you need to account for. So you have to double your your quilt fabric need in order to get that overhang. So it gives you
Hmm.
kind of a description
Okay.
both in a visual and also in a recommended fabric.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, because I think people don't maybe necessarily know why you have to have double, it's like, well, the width of fabric, your quilt top isn't gonna fit within the 42 inches that you're given. And but being able to see it, it's like, oh, that makes sense. And when you've done it a million times or you've made a ton of backings or pieced a ton of backings, like it becomes like second nature. You don't have to think about it. You just know, like, oh, I need this much because of this reason. And so I think it's helpful to see it, especially if you're newer to quilting or just haven't really put a lot of your own backings together. And like I always reference like with my clients, like, do you like horizontal seam versus a vertical seam in the backing? Because yes, with the grain and like the directionality of the fabric, sometimes a vertical seam is necessary, but it's also not as nice to long arm on because that center seam actually creates a lot of tension through the middle of the quilt, where then the sides kind of end up sagging. Um, and so it can end up creating some like folds and extra volume in the backing, but sometimes it's necessary. And so we have ways to like kind of work around that. But a horizontal seam, if you can get away with it, is like the width of your quilt is usually for in my preference, like because it creates a more even tension across the whole backing of the quilt as you're quilting it and makes for a smoother backing. So just to throw that out there.
That's an incredibly fun fact. I didn't know that. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I've never
Yeah.
long armed myself, and so that makes a
Yeah.
ton of sense.
Yeah.
From
It's
like a
interesting.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I want to make a video showing like, but it's hard because I convince so many of my clients either just by wide back or to piece their backing down the or like a horizontal seam. I forget to like capture if I do have a vertical seam um to make that content. But I do eventually want to, and I might even just like sew some fabric together to demonstrate it because I think it's interesting for people to actually see it. And this helps, like having diagrams and having this calculator show you what it's supposed to look like and why it looks that way is helpful because I think sometimes people just don't know, and that's okay. Like it's our job to educate them, right? Like with if you've got knowledge of how to do things a little bit better, it's like not that I need to tell everybody my own method, but like for long arming specifically, like on a big frame, like there's reasons why I ask you to do what I'm asking you to do. I'm not just being crazy, like, you know?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I'm with you. I want a high quality product. I want you to feel like we both did well together. So
yeah.
please listen when I say that I have suggestions. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. For sure. But
Yeah,
this
so
is so
that's
cool.
those are the three calculators. The main one obviously being that quilt top piecing yardage calculator. If you have a better name, if you're in marketing, call me. I'm not in marketing and I
Help
struggle
us
with it quite a bit, as you may see. So
help
if
a
you
girl
have
out.
ideas.
Yeah. No, and I think too for search optimization, it's hard because it's like you don't want to call it something cutesy that like doesn't get it found if somebody's searching like quilting calculator or like quilt piecing calculator. It's like who knows what people search in Google and like you want your product to pop up. And so yeah, marketing, help us out. Like let's get this thing seen and searchable and yeah, it's like you don't want it to be a mouthful, but you want it to make sense and be searchable at the same time. So I totally feel that. You're like, what do I call this?"
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you definitely want a good search game. For those that are curious, when I searched "not your grannies," like it immediately came up with quilt show. So she's got a good search term here. Very nice. Very proud of you.
Wow, thank you so much. That's awesome. That's that's good to know. I think sometimes I just like I'm like, well, I'm hoping for the best with this, but
Yeah.
some thought goes into what I do. I'm not a total dingbat all the time. So but well, yeah, that's so cool. Thank you for sharing that with us because I think, yeah, the more eyes on it and the more people using it, then like the more feedback you can get too. Like you can keep
Yes.
improving on it. And obviously, you've said it multiple times, you want that. So if people are open to giving kind, I'm stressing kind and constructive feedback, then that's awesome. Like, because again, like, we're here to help each other out. And if we want to keep our community strong, like that communication key is like communication is key. And offering like not just being like, well, I've never made that quilt and I don't like it. It's like that's not helpful, But if I can say, oh my gosh, like I see you're saying you're struggling with this thing, and here's the tip I have because I've dealt with that same exact thing, or like hey, this little part of your website is a kind of buggy. Like, is there anything we can do to fix that? Like, heck yes, thank you so much. Like, that's what helps keep our community strong is that we help each other when we're struggling, or I mean, not that you're struggling, but just in that sense of like, yeah, if people are using it and they find that something could be improved or maybe there is a bug and they help you find that, then that's great. Like you said, it's a hobby and you're building it for yourself, but also to be able to share with others. And so I think that's really great. And I'm excited to see a more in-depth calculator. Like I said, the ones I've seen before, it's not, they don't take into account the components. You have to tell it, like, you can't say, oh, I want to make this many half square triangles. You just say, I need to cut this many squares, and it'll give you, again, round it up. But it's like, okay, but then you have to think about, okay, then I need to turn that into this and turn it into that. So I love that yours takes, like, you can take the basic components of standard quilt blocks and you can tell it, I need this many, so tell me how much fabric I need. Like, that is so helpful and so cool. And like I said, I have this quilt I need to make. I've designed it, but I need to make it. And I'm like, well, I know each block needs to be a certain size, but I don't necessarily know the math perfectly for how to get that many flying geese of that size and that many, you know, the 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 different components of that. So that'll be really handy and I'm really excited to use it for
Yeah,
reals and
yeah.
not just
I
see
will
it as a
say I
demo.
see all over Instagram people expressing like confusion or frustration with quote unquote quilt math.
Yeah.
And I would love to be the reason that you aren't frustrated with quilt math anymore. So that's my call out to everyone. Like, go ahead, try it so that you hopefully are less frustrated with quilt math.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
That's awesome. Can we talk about the quilt behind you for a minute? Your no quilt?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
In Quarter Inch Collective, I think I also talked about this a little bit too. But so yeah, this was my deep dive into traditional quilt blocks. And so this quilt has a handful of really common traditional quilt blocks, you know, your log cabin, your courthouse steps, but it also has some more complex ones, things like Storm at Sea, and a pineapple quilt block and a bear paw.
Yeah.
Do feel free to call out for anyone interested that these are not considered traditional for whatever reason. If they were like the pineapple one, I have no idea when that was truly made. But
I don't either.
um, in each of these traditional quilt blocks, I have the word no with a period pieced into it. And I pieced with foundation paper piecing on within the no itself.
Mhm.
So the no is almost transparent within the block itself. And the idea behind it was I was presented with a suggestion for a summer challenge from my quilt guild. Shout out to Bruce to make a quilt with, you know, I quilt, therefore I think, or I think for therefore I quilt, I should say.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not a word art person. I respect the word art game. I also giggle at the store when there's, you know, this is my beer drawer, not my vegetable drawer kind of
Oh,
thing in
yeah.
your refrigerator or the like.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm personally not a let's write words into art and put it up on our walls person. So I wanted to kind of hide the words that is going to be in your quilt. And I liked the idea of kind of embedding it within a quilt block.
Mhm.
And I put the word no inside a traditional quilt block because some of the best advice I've received personally is no is a complete sentence.
Mhm.
Folks spend a lot of time explaining themselves or like giving niceties as to a reason why they aren't going to do something or aren't going to agree to something.
Yeah.
Um, and that's perfectly fine. That's polite society, giving explanation, totally reasonable, vast majority of the time. There is a point in a conversation where you do need to just say no and need the person to hear it.
Mhm.
And so the idea that no is a complete sentence is kind of more so giving you the confidence. If that needed to happen, you can do it. That is totally allowed.
Mhm.
And so I put them in traditional quilt blocks because there are women before me who said no to a lot worse than what I have experienced in modern day life, that has ultimately led me to have the modern day life that I had. So
Yeah.
putting that really groundbreaking advice that I, you know, experienced in my early 20s
Mhm.
into traditional quilt blocks to kind of show respect for the women's movement over time, basically.
Yeah. I love that so much. And it is hard to, especially as a woman, to say no and feel heard and feel that your no is respected. And so I love that you built it into and not just plastered it on top of, but you built the word into the quilt block itself, into that traditional piece of quilting that has come from the hands of women over time. And, especially women, like maybe men helped quilt at some point throughout history, but traditionally it's been a woman's task to make quilts. And so I just when you were explaining it in the quarter inch collective meeting and like hearing it again, I'm just like, yes, this is so what a cool use of like traditional quilt block making, but also foundation paper piecing and expressing like, yeah, that modern idea that you have the right to say no and you don't have to over explain yourself.
It's my first time making a foundation paper piecing pattern,
Yeah.
which I'll note is like way more intuitive than I originally thought. There's tweaks that I'd love to make to this if anyone ever wanted to use it, but
Uh-huh.
it's really just a matter of effectively drawing what you want a foundation paper piece and then breaking it into the pieces that need to come together. Just due to how foundation paper piecing works, you can't have partial seams, for example.
Right.
And so I broke them up and then I printed it out. I broke them up in a digital designer and then I printed them out and then I just foundation paper pieced. A lot of it was getting the points to match up, which
Yeah.
I'd say I spent probably 50% of the time piecing it and then 50% of the time like correcting my piecing. Uh,
Yeah.
but ultimately it's come out quite nice. I'm pretty happy with it. I did submit it to QuiltCon,
You
but
did.
it's a small quilt, and apparently small quilts have to be in the small quilt category.
Yeah.
Had I known that, I probably would have made the blocks quite a bit bigger,
Mm.
because I do think that it fits better in the modern traditionalism category. But
Yeah.
if it gets accepted, I'll be very happy, and I'm not going to complain.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes the smaller quilts are the most impactful because they pack a punch, right? It's like you didn't need a giant quilt to get your point across. And sometimes a giant quilt is necessary, but I think this is like more to the point of like you can it almost illustrates that like you can have all this stuff going on in the background and you can have all these reasons why, but the no is still there. The
Yeah,
no is still the basis of why that's in the place it's in. And like and that's impactful. I think, it's visually stunning. It's got good color balance and like good contrast too to make the no stand out. So you know what you're looking at. And but it is within the quilt block itself. So you're kind of like, well, wait, how does that like it invites question and curiosity, which I don't know. I think it's
thank
great.
you
I
so
hope
much.
I hope
Yeah.
it gets in too, because I want to see it in real life. I want to see it in person. So
Yeah, thank you. I admit I have to give thank you for the contrast to my husband because I
Mm,
originally made it where you kind of can't see the no because again I'm not a word art person and
yeah.
he was like, "Isn't the point of it like you can just say it without feeling like you need to hide behind excuses?" And I was like, "Oh, I guess a little bit of contrast makes sense." So thank
Okay,
you, I
okay.
appreciate it. I'll pass that along to him.
Yeah, yeah, that was great advice, and thank you, husband, for that because yeah, it's like sometimes we can't see that we're like repeating our own kind of behavioral pattern in within things that we're doing unless somebody points it out to us because it's like inherent, I guess, maybe to like shy away from saying no or to be more discreet about it or to like not want to hurt people's feelings about it. And but just like you said, no is a complete sentence and that's okay. Like women have to stop taking responsibility for men's feelings or other people's feelings in general and not to go out and hurt people's feelings, but I think it's just been unfairly dumped on women to make nice with other people's bad behavior.
Yeah, completely agreed. Completely agreed. Yeah.
So this is great. I love it so much.
Well, thank you so much for this space. I mean,
Yeah.
I cannot show appreciation enough, especially for those that went to the Quarter Inch Collective and saw the bug. It's resolved now, and there are new features coming. I'm so excited to share this. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for the space.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for reaching out and again because I had already seen the quarter your presentation in the quarter inch collective. I was like, "Oh yeah, of course." Like I think sometimes like I my like ADHD gets the best of me where I like see a person and I've interacted and I know I want to like talk to that person. And then it's like, if I don't write it down or if it doesn't get into my calendar, it goes like in one ear and out the other. And then, so I appreciate that you reached out because like, yes, this is exactly the vibe. This is exactly what this show is about, is like informing people of new things that are happening and giving people some new information and just getting to know quilters that are out there in this space trying to just make the world a better place, like with what we can offer each other. So this has been really amazing and we want people to go check this out. So it's at gibsonthreads.com
Yes.
and the quilt calculator is there and
And
you have
I am Gibson Threads on Instagram as well.
okay. So Instagram at Gibson Threads, and I'll put links to your website and to your Instagram in the show notes so people can get to your quilt calculator immediately and they don't have to try to search it up. They can try Googling it to see if like help it pop up more.
Please do, yeah. If you just have a spare 45 minutes, just go ahead and Google various search terms and make sure that you click on my links over other links. I'm joking for anyone that's not understanding the sarcasm, but
You're like, just take the time, would you? But also if you have the time, you could do that because that'd be cool. But no pressure. I'm just joking. Well, thank you so much again for sharing. And I'm so excited to see the new features get released and to actually use it and work with it because like I said, I've got a project coming up that I'm really actually super stoked to use it for. So this is really perfect timing for me.
Fantastic. Great to hear. Great to hear.
Yeah,
Thank you so
yeah.
much.
And we'll stay in touch.
Stay in touch. Yes, thank you so much.